Triangle congruence theorems. So on the last lesson, we learned about congruence, and we learned that for two shapes to be congruent, they have to have the same shape and same size. Well, now we're given a few shortcuts to help us to decide if two triangles are congruent. This will keep us from having to check all of the sides and all of the angles. So the first triangle theorem that we're looking at is side, 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 or SSS. If three sides of one triangle are congruent to the corresponding sides of the other, the triangles are congruent. So this theorem keeps us from even having to check to see if the angles are congruent. So this tells us if all of the sides are congruent, then all the angles are congruent as well, meaning all of both of the triangles are congruent. Side angle side, or SAS. If two sides and the included angle of one triangle are congruent to two sides and the included angle of the other triangle, then the triangles are congruent. And by included angle, we mean the angle that is in between the two sides. Angle side angle, or ASA. If two angles and the included side of one triangle are congruent to two angles and the included side of the other triangle, the triangles are congruent. And again, by included, we mean the side that is in between the two angles. Angle angle side, or AAS. If two angles and the non-included side of one triangle are congruent to two angles and the non-included side of another triangle, then the triangles are congruent. And lastly, hypotenuse leg. If two right triangles have a congruent hypotenuse and a corresponding congruent leg, the triangles are congruent. Let's take a look at our examples. So we see that we're giving two triangles that are connected. Do we all see that the triangles share an angle? See how they're connected here? They share this angle. That tells us that these two angles are congruent. So now as we take a look at this, we see we have one side, an angle, and another side. And for this triangle, we also have one side, an angle, and another side. We also see that that angle is in between the two sides. So that tells us that the triangle congruence theorem is side, angle, side. Example 2. So again, we see that these triangles share an angle, which tells us that these angles are congruent. And we're using two angle arcs because we already have one angle arc used. So as we take a look here, we see that we have one angle, another angle, and a side, okay? So this reads angle, angle, side, angle, angle, side. It can't be angle, side, angle because the side is not between the two angles. So this theorem is angle, angle, side. All right, let's take a look at example 3. So we see that these two triangles share a side. So just like with the last example where they shared an angle, so that meant that those two angles were congruent, this is telling us that these sides are congruent, which makes sense because if they share a side, then the sides must be the same length. So we're going to use one tick mark to represent that. And that's because we've already used 2 tick marks and 3 tick marks here. So taking a look at this figure, I see that for each triangle, we have 3 congruent sides. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. So that tells us that the theorem is side, side, side. Example 4, we see that again that we're sharing angles. So that means that these angles are congruent. So we have a side, an angle in between, and another side for this triangle. And for this triangle, we have an angle and then a side and another side. So this is actually not congruent. So be very careful when looking at the problems because we see that if we had just focused on this one triangle, we would have thought that it was side, angle, side. But we see that this triangle is not marked in the same way that this one is, so therefore it's not congruent. So make sure that you always check both triangles. Example 5, so we share an angle. So I'll put 2 angle arcs here and 2 angle arcs here. And if we read this in order, we have an angle, a side, and then an angle. And also for this one, angle, side, angle. So that tells us that the congruence theorem is angle, side, angle. All right, lastly, we see this box here, and this box tells us that this is a right angle, which means that this is a right triangle. Now these share an angle, so that means that this is also a right angle. So the only theorem that we have that deals with right triangles is hypotenuse leg. So let's go ahead and check and see if this, meets the requirements for hypotenuse leg. So here's our hypotenuse for this triangle, and here's the hypotenuse for this triangle. We are told that the 2 hypotenuses are congruent. They're corresponding congruent. And we also see that we have a corresponding congruent leg. So it is safe to say that this theorem is hypotenuse leg.